So now we will head into the second segment of the debate. And this segment is based on how these ideals would be placed in a real world scenario given our current time and in the country of the United States of America. And I'd like to hand the floor over to the Socialist Alternative Group.
Sure. So let me just first off say, we're also advocating for freedom and liberty. The kind of freedom and liberty we advocate for is the freedom from exploitation, the freedom from oppression that you get under capitalism. That you can't escape under capitalism because these wars that you mentioned aren't just manifestations of the political realities of capitalism, they're manifestations of the economic reality. And there's an economic material reason that the U.S. intervened in Iraq. There's an economic reason that the U.S. intervened anyway, because the state, as you mentioned, is a apparatus of control, but it's really about protecting this one economic class, the owners of the means of production, the factories, the big agribusiness, what we would call the commanding ranks of the economy. These people are working for their protection of their private property, and totally against the interests of the majority of people in our society, or the working class. With that said, the ways to fight against capitalism today are really varied. I mean, we're a global organization as well. We're in over 40 countries around the world. Our organization in Greece, for example, we call for an indefinite general strike to bring down capitalism. We don't call for that here in the U.S. We do advocate entering elections, supporting candidates that are not part of big business and part of the ruling class. We even ran a candidate last election cycle, Shama Sawant, in Washington State for Speaker of the House of Representatives. She was able to win 29% of the vote. I mean, this shows that socialist ideas are gaining ground, and we don't think that we can achieve socialism through election. But I mean, if you can win 29% of the vote, the movement you can generate through that is amazing. You can change society. I mean, society is only going to change, as we see in history, through mass movements. It can be generated by running candidates like this that can win 29% or even more than that.
All right, that's enough. Thank you. 3 minutes. Not that that's enough like that. Now I'd like to hand the floor over to Students for Liberty. So how would you impose your views in society today?
The beauty of libertarianism is that there won't be any imposing. You're free to do as you want as long as you're not harming anyone else. So we're not per se imposing anything, but in order to kind of answer your question, in order to kind of progress a libertarian society, at least from the current state of affairs, it would be towards bringing about the minimalization of the state in economic and social affairs. So essentially, we believe in social and economic freedom, social freedom, the ability to do as you please, and economic freedom, the ability to provide for yourself as you deem necessary, without any government intervention. So essentially, the best way that we can get towards a society is essentially decreasing the role of the state in these particular hemispheres of society. So essentially, what we need to do is also have what I would like to call an intellectual revolution. Until we as individuals come together and understand that government, the state, the usage of force, putting a gun to someone's head and telling them to do something for the good of whoever, whether it be the majority or the minority, it's wrong, it's immoral, it's not right to sit here and force individuals to do what you want them to do in the guise of some social well-being. That is immoral, it's wrong, it's not right. So essentially, until we sit here and we voluntarily cooperate with one another, we're going to continue to have these problems because the problem fundamentally lies in the philosophy undermining communism, socialism, democracy, or republicanism. The fact is, there's a state in existence. The state utilizes force to procure its ends. And until we understand that violence is not the solution to our problems, we're never going to resolve anything. So essentially, A, minimalize the role of the state in the social and economic realms until it is virtually obsolete, and also come to a consensus amongst one another that it's about time we put the gun down. We need to stop fighting with one another. We need to stop forcing people to do things. We need to sit here and have intellectual conversations, philosophical conversations with one another in order to understand the fundamental issues concerning our society as a whole. So until we do that, there will be absolutely no way to progress towards a libertarian society, a free society.
Now, when you're from the Students Without Borders group, how would you impose your views in society today?
So basically, the way we get to communism is first we need to overthrow the system that is known as capitalism. The system of private property, a system where the minority of the population, as they say, the 1%, has control over the government and goes to war. The capitalist United States, since World War II, has been involved in war in Korea, Lebanon, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Dominican Republic, Congo, Cambodia, Libya several times, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Iraq again, Afghanistan, Libya, as well as being involved covertly in many other countries in defense of the ruling class in this country, the capitalist class, in defense of private property. So basically, we need to overthrow that system. And the way we're going to do that is not through elections. The only way to do that is through revolution. Now, we're not at a point where we're going to be able to make revolution at this point. Now we need to raise consciousness and organize the masses to prepare for that. But basically, the whole point of socialism, I'll get to that, we can't do it through voting, because history showed us that whenever a leftist, populist government comes to power through voting, it ends up being overthrown with a reactionary coup and mass execution of opposition. For example, in Chile, where Pinochet, aided by libertarian Chicago School, Milton Friedman economics, overthrew the democratically elected government of Allende, and Pinochet proceeded to make mass executions of leftists and communists in the country. Or an example of Indonesia, where populist leader came to power and he was overthrown. Sukarno was overthrown by Sukarno, and there was mass executions of leftists there. So basically, it's going to come through a revolution. And the only way that we're going to get to communism in a classless society is by breaking down those class contradictions with the proletariat, the working class, the 99%, as they say, in power, having state power.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to thank the representatives of all three parties for telling us how they would implement their ideals in the real world. Let's move on to the third segment. This is more of the debate part of the debate. During this part, the audience gets to ask questions to the representatives, and the representatives may ask questions to each other and argue their viewpoints. But first, I'd like to ask a question to each representative. So I'll start with Students Without Borders. You said that we don't need all these wars and this imperialistic type of government, but some would say that imperialism is needed to maintain economic and military superiority in the world, and that America would lose its power by implementing your ideals. What do you say to that?
Absolutely. We're opposed to imperialism. We're opposed to the domination of one country. We do not. I do not believe that the United States has the right to dictate to other countries, nor other countries dictate the United States. And it's absolutely true that if the United States can intervene in all these countries all over the world, corporations in the United States will not have as easy access to resources for them to build things. So that's absolutely true. And the point is that capitalism cannot exist without that. That's absolutely true. That's why we're opposed to capitalism, because we do not want to see this mass destruction all over the world, this endless list of wars ever since World War II. That is because of the profit motive. The ruling class the capitalist class has control over the government and dictates to the government what to do. And for example, in Iraq recently, everyone knows that was a war over oil and the benefit of the oil companies. So basically, that is true, but we are not for capitalism, we are for the overthrow of capitalism because it is an inhumane system that perpetuates all of that.
Thank you. My next question goes to the Students for Liberty Party. You mentioned that you would like to see people have more authority over themselves, to use different words. You would like to decrease the role of the state, and that violence is not the answer to problems. But who will protect the citizens if you take away the gun restrictions we have now, or if certain citizens decide to attack one another? How do you control for that in such a political view?
Well, the beauty of libertarianism is individual sovereignty, self-ownership, the autonomous factor, the fact that you essentially have authority over yourself. So to answer your question, who would protect themselves? The people. If the state didn't take away the guns from the people, if they didn't legislate that we need to have X amount of clips or we need to have these background checks and all these bureaucratic means to defending oneself, then there would probably be less crime because individuals would be more inclined to defend themselves and less inclined to harm another, given the consideration that the likelihood of them having a weapon and the ability to defend themselves is more inclined. What if everyone in this room had a weapon? If everyone in this room had a gun? How quick would any of you would be to pull out a weapon and essentially shoot at another?
Just look at the cop.
You would be foolish to do so. That wouldn't be intelligent for you to do so. Essentially, a lot of the problems we have in terms of gun controls has to do with the fact that we don't necessarily understand the principles founding the Second Amendment in the Constitution, which is the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms is essentially about you having the right to your life. And in you having the right to your life, you indisputably have the right to defend yourself. So it's not necessarily about having guns, it's just ability to defend yourself. And guns is an object in which you can defend yourself. So in that instance, in a minimalized state, individuals essentially would protect themselves, militias would form. But I'm trying to get away from that. I'm really trying to get away from that because I'm advocating a free society, a society free from violence. So essentially, ideally, there would be no need for guns in this society. The only reason guns exist to a large degree, and many would question this, is because humans are insecure, and we have the state to defend our insecurity. Instead of solving our problems and coming to a real solution as to why we're afraid and what are we afraid of as humans and individuals, we're not gonna come to a viable solution as to what we should do to protect ourselves. So, I mean, in going towards that approach, I think we should just consider, what can we do as an alternative to, defending ourselves by means of weaponry and violence.
Thank you for your response. And I have one last question to the Socialist Alternative Group. You said you were against protecting private property, and you'd rather protect the worker instead. But when you stop protecting private property, some people would say that it gets rid of incentives for people to work, and the government starts to control these incentives. But what happens when the government starts to control incentives is sometimes you get a bit of corruption in the government. So what is your answer to that?
Well, first of all, I don't think we'd say that the government and the people in a social society would actually be two distinct entities. The idea is that everyone would, in a sense, be part of the government, be the government. People would elect to run the economy and run the world and the state. That would be stateless. The other part of the question about the right of property, when we say we want to get rid of private property, we're not talking about your shirt off your back or even a family-owned business. We're talking about the commanding heights of the economy, things that should be publicly owned because it doesn't make sense that they're privately owned. I mean, huge, large-scale industry, which in most countries, and thing is actually publicly owned. It's like the fire department. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to run this for profit. You don't call 911 if your house is on fire and have to relay some insurance information before your fire spreads to the rest of the neighborhood. That's just not how things should work in an efficient, well-run society.
Thank you. And now, the representative from Students Without Borders would like to pose a question.
No, I'd like to just make a point about gun control. The fact is, as you mentioned, just because we don't want militias to form, that doesn't mean that they won't. Militias will form if we get rid of the state immediately. The point is to have a period of time where we weaken the class contradictions and make everyone on an equal level or on a more equal level, because, I mean, we may not want it, but if we get rid of the state right now, though militias will form, and those who have more power will be much more powerful, and those who don't have power will not be able to do anything, and we'll have an even more oppressive system. We could just look at Somalia, where there's no state, and there's pretty much living hell right there, with stateless, capitalist Somalia. So we just have to look there to see where there is a basically stateless free market, and we can look at the results very clearly.
Well, in response to that, see, the thing is, the core of these issues stem from the very fact that there's a centralized authority of power, which is the state. And in order for anyone to succeed in doing anything, whether it be, allocating resources, whether it be protecting your well-being, it fundamentally requires that we use the central power to force other people to do things. So the question that I pose to the communist and the socialist camps here on campus is, if you guys are here and you're here to relieve society from oppression, and you're trying to create some sort of freedom in society, how can you possibly achieve that if your mode of doing so is achieved through force and not through reason, not through advice, not through cooperation? The socialists and the communists preach cooperation and working among society, doing things with each other. However, if that's the case, wouldn't socialism exist or communism exist best if there was no state involved to procure that? Because in essence, what we're doing here is cooperating. Why would we have to force people to cooperate, to live their lives accordingly to what the central authority deems the right way of life? We're all individuals here. We all have our individual desires, our individual pursuits, and our individual needs. Yes, we're humans, and yes, we have basic necessities which span across our humanity. However, they vary individually. How are we supposed to account for that through a socialized mechanism of one standard, one size fits all? That's economically inefficient, it is immoral, and it's not just, it's not equal, it's not right. So if you ask me, if we're going to achieve any of this, the way that we're going to do this is through a voluntary society, through individuals gathering with one another and agreeing to do something for mutual benefit. The exchange is equal here. To sit here and say that capitalism is simply for the profit motive is fallacious. Of course people want to profit, but people can't profit unless they provide a qualitative good to the consumer that they voluntarily choose to consume. So the profits, hold on, let me finish. The profits that come from capitalism come from the fact that you consumers, you individuals are purchasing the good. So to sit here and try to demonize the capitalists who've been producing, who've been creating, who've been innovating, who've been entrepreneurs and giving to society, and substitute that for taking from one group to give to another, what's that going to lead to? Well, that's going to lead to the same problem that we have now. And that problem is a group utilizing force over the interest of another group. So we have a socialist society. Great, we have a socialist society. Guess what now? Who are the oppressed? The capitalists. Aren't the capitalists then justified to overthrow the socialist state for their own good, for their own well-being? Do you not see here that the problem is fundamentally inside the coercive state? The fact that we use force and violence to achieve our ends. And until we get away from that preconceived notion of allocating resources and protecting ourselves through force, we're not going to succeed in anything. Whether it's an allocation of resources, whether it's promoting our individuality or well-being as a social community. So that's essentially, the gist of what I'm trying to say here.
Okay, thanks to the students for the vivacious and quite lengthy question.
You're welcome.
I'd like to let the socialist alternative camp answer the question first.
Yeah, so if I could just respond to that with maybe a rhetorical question. When capitalism first started, and when Europeans and North Americans went into Africa and Latin America and basically stole all of their primary goods back to their countries to reproduce and make these so-called quality goods and then sell them back to them, was that profiting off of making quality goods? Was that not coercing people to basically be slaves, to work in their copper mines, to work in their diamond mines, to make things, and then force them to buy it back from them? Was that not coercion?
The thing is, you're misassociating the cause here.
That wasn't the start of capitalism.
It's not capitalism. Capitalism is
defined by Adam Smith. That
voluntary.
wasn't the beginning of capitalism.
Let's get away from that. Let's not talk about Adam Smith. Let's simply talk about the philosophies here that we're talking about. Let's get away from history. Let's talk about now. No. Let's not focus on.
Let's just forget everything that happened.
It's But it's reality. Yes, it is. That's without question. But the point is, if we're going to move forward, we have to look at things as they are now, in the present. We sit here and we revere history, and we over-revere it to the point where we manifest history all over again. The fact is, communism failed. The fact is, communism failed. Socialism has failed, and capitalism, which today isn't really capitalism, is crony capitalism, is capitalism forced by the state, still succeeds. It's still around. It's still productive. It's still flourishing. Although there's all these mishaps in the society, which I agree with, the fact is, capitalism is still working. And unfortunately, to sit here and try to bring about socialism or communism is not a progressive means, because it hasn't worked.
Ask the people in Greece if it's still flourishing. The people that have to steal firewood to burn and to keep warm during the winter.
That's not very helpful.
People like to say, communism's failed, communism is dead, socialism is dead, communism is dead. And the reality is, if someone woke up every morning and said Napoleon is dead, Napoleon is dead, Napoleon is dead, you think they're insane. The reason why these people say this is because they don't want the masses to think that there's an alternative to capitalism, an extremely oppressive system which kills. And you could say this is crony capitalism. This isn't real capitalism. The fact is, you cannot divorce these things from reality. You cannot just think of these things in your mind and say this is what capitalism is. Capitalism is what he mentioned, that mercantilism that is the early stage of capitalism. You cannot deny that it's capitalism. So, the fact saying that communism has failed, I'd like to see some evidence of that. The point is, when you're transitioning from one system to another, it's not just going in one direction. It can go back and forth and back and forth. Look at France. It's called the Fourth Republic. Capitalism failed many times when it was moving away from feudalism. And the fact is that even though the Soviet Union does not exist anymore, China does not exist anymore. In Russia today, the biggest opposition party is the Communist Party. Now, they're not going to come in through elections. It's only going to be through armed struggle and revolution. But the fact is that the Russian people still support communism. And if we just have to look at places in the third world where there are active struggles going on, we can look at India, where Maoist rebels have control over 2/3 of the countryside and are expanding and are providing all kinds of benefits, health benefits, education, and all other kinds of benefits to the poor peasantry that the capitalist state is unable to provide for them. We can look at the Philippines, where there's an armed insurrection going on to overthrow the corrupt government, capitalist government. And the fact is to say that because there is state involved in capitalism, that means there isn't, that's not real capitalism. We just need to look at the founder of the Mises Institute, which is the head of the Austrian School of Economics, basically one of the libertarian gods, a libertarian god who's connected with all these organizations. He said that just because there's state involved in the economy, that doesn't mean that it's not real capitalism. That the majority of the economy is privately owned. That's not a mixed system. That's capitalism. Even the free market fundamentalist founder of the libertarian Austrian School of Economics admits that. So it's ridiculous to say that the state being involved in the economy isn't real capitalism. Communists acknowledge, Marxists acknowledge that any state is the dictatorship of one class. That's why it's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. When people say dictatorship of the proletariat, it doesn't mean one man rule, authoritarianism. It means the rule of a class, the rule of the proletariat, the rule of the vast majority. What we have now in the United States, they can call it a democracy, this or that. Even though it acts in fascist ways, we just need to look at the NDA and other things like that, Patriot Act, other things like that. The United States is a dictatorship of the capitalist class. It's run by the capitalist class. And again, we cannot divorce ideas from reality. Ideas must come from reality. If someone it comes up to you and stabs you, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna say, oh, that didn't really happen because in my imagination that didn't happen? No, you're going to want them to go to prison or for there to be some kind of action taken against them because in reality he stabbed you. He didn't give you money or something. He didn't give you a handshake. So you cannot divorce these ideas from reality.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry, I'd like to cut you off there because now it's time for the audience to ask questions. Yes. And please direct to whom you're addressing the question to, unless it's all.
No, it's for student delivery. Now, because I've read about libertarianism and things like this, it sounds to me not so much that you're describing libertarianism, which I understand that it's, well, like when you're talking about the creation of militias or people just defending themselves, from what I understand, it's just a minimal amount of government involvement on either side in the economy. But to me, it sounds more like you're talking about it as a sort of anarchism along the lines of Stirner or Benjamin Tucker. Well, how would, like, not even like capitalism, just a full individual society. Would that be more along those lines?
Yeah, personally, that's where I am. That's where I am personally. Essentially, like I described earlier, libertarianism is a philosophy, so it has different schools. So essentially, you have the limited government libertarians who believe that the role of the government should not exceed that of protecting individual rights, life, and property. So essentially, that is where I once stood. However, I have recently rejected the state because I find that the state is the coercive entity which essentially even requires the necessity for that type of protection. So until we eliminate the state, or not necessarily eliminate it, because I'm not anti-state. I don't want to eliminate the state per se. I want to find a way to transcend the state, kind of make it obsolete in a sense. It's like the political process is, if you ask me, is an artifact today. It's like that technology that it came out and it was profound when it first came out. It did wonderful things for society. However, it's now to that point where we have new technologies. We have new means of approaching the way that we can allocate resources, through the free market and individual cooperation. And until we do that, we're not going to be able to essentially live in a truly peaceful and voluntary society. We're going to sit here and we're going to bicker amongst ourselves within the political process. We're going to have the communists on the right, the socialists on the left. I don't mean ideologically, I just mean physically, arguing and bickering about who should do this and why we should do it, instead of just gathering with the people who want to do the same things that you want to do. And it's that simple. It really is. The political process in and of itself impedes social progress. So personally, I think that, libertarianism is the best route to manifest a voluntary society, which is anarchism.
All right, your response time is over. Thank you. So everyone gets 2 minutes to answer a question. Paul?
I have a question for the libertarian representative.
Yeah, so my issue with libertarianism has always been that, yes, all humans vary in their desires and their behaviors. Right? The problem is that some people are more conducive to feel than others, and they're more likely to act on desires that are inherently infringing on other people. People are more like psychopaths, they're more willing to murder someone, or manipulate someone to get ahead. But how would the problem is that how do you deal with the fact that I believe that libertarianism puts too much faith in human beings cooperating. So my question is to you: how would like an ideal libertarian society deal with people whose desires are inherently infringing on others? Wouldn't you have to resort to a state or some sort of force power to deal with these individuals?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking that. Essentially, I have a philosophy and a person that, you can't solve violence with violence. Vengeance is never a solution. And that's essentially the way that the state resolves these matters. And to assess your question more directly, I think that in the instance of, from the limited government libertarian scope review, essentially you would still have that. Essentially, the state would exist to essentially prosecute those individuals who cause those harms. However, in the society that I'm kind of envisioning, more, I guess, anarcho-libertarian, if I think, would essentially have private institutions or private communal gatherings, private, essentially, organizations that gather with one another with the interest of, preserving justice or attaining justice on some level. I would hope that if that were the case, it wouldn't be necessarily through violence, coming about to some sort of understanding of why the event had occurred and what can be done going forward more positively versus in just throwing someone in jail and throwing away the key.
Thank you. I believe the gentleman in the striped green shirt had a question earlier.
Yeah. Okay, so I have questions for both sides, but since the parents have some questions for the last social science. So, I guess in general, for both of you, how would you control the means of production services? Try. Obviously, theoretically, the most efficient way would be to have everyone's dictated what that actually means. However, how would the proletariat, which, as you said, which everyone knows the vast majority, is a huge number. How would they control the means of production in an efficient way? How would it be possible?
First, the Students Without Borders means fund.
So basically, the way the means of production would be controlled, basically want to get to a communist society, which is a stateless, classless society. And we can't do that by just ripping away the state immediately, because the people who have power, they're going to have more power than others, and we're not going to get to a classless society. So the point is to have socialism, which is where the proletariat, the working class, the vast majority, have control over the state, and the industry becomes nationalized and used in the interest of the vast majority of the population. And we can look at historical examples, for example, in the Soviet Union, where at the time of the revolution, 1917, Russia was an extremely backward country, was losing the war against Germany because it had very little industry, was an extremely backward country. At the time of the revolution, there was a higher percentage of African Americans in the United States that were literate than Russians that were literate in Russia. So Russia was an extremely backward country at the time of the revolution, and the 5-year plan installed by Stalin was a central planning. It was a centrally planned plan for organizing society and industrialization. And the Soviet Union was able to, through the 5-year plan, industrialize the country, send electricity to all of the country, educate the population, and was able to defeat Nazi Germany, and it became so powerful. American historians acknowledge that 90 to 95% of the fighting or the destruction of the German army was from the Soviet army. So if it weren't for that central planning that Stalin implemented, Nazi Germany would have taken over the world and basically killed off anyone who was subhuman. So basically, something along those lines, which was very successful as we saw. And then after World War II, 70% of the economy was destroyed from the war, and they rebuilt that all again. Now, these kinds of things have never been seen in capitalist society or any type of society. And they were able to catch up with the West, put someone in space before the West, and so basically we need a centralized economy through socialism to get to communism.
Thank you. And now, let me just let the other party answer.
I agree with Nick on a lot of points that he made. That Soviet Union was able to move ahead in amazing leaps and bounds because of this advantage of the fine economy. It shows how efficient it can be, even with what we would say is this really top-down, undemocratic, bureaucratic mess that they had over there that didn't allow for workers' control of the government or economy. So we wouldn't advocate for exactly that type of planned economy, but we would advocate for a planned economy. I mean, if you look at the major corporations that we say run the world right now, BP, Walmart, GE, they're already planned economies. They already plan out exactly what they're doing. They just do it on the basis of their private profit and their exploitation of everyone who works beneath them. We would do it in the reverse. Everyone who works there at that company would be working in order to not just make the most profit, not to make the most money, that they'd be working to make things the most efficient, to guarantee that human need was satisfied, to guarantee that the planet isn't being destroyed. They wouldn't advocate for drilling for oil, while the ice caps are melting. They advocate to rebuild our infrastructure so that it runs on technology that's not dependent on destroying our environment. So, I mean, you can see how that would work.
Just to respond to what I spoke about. And West Germany was able to rebuild itself from total destruction, total annihilation, to a vastly superior economy to that of East Germany.
Marshall Plan.
Regardless,
So the U.S.
Let him finish his question.
the Soviet Union also required vast amounts of food to be imported from the United States. The United States has been the breadbasket of the world for generations. And China also imports food from us. Considering that, it seems like the Soviet Union, instead of having, as you said, the best interest of its workers or its people, seems to have the best interest of the government. Putting the person into space didn't have that much of an effect on the common man. All it did was show that we are powerful when someone in space. It didn't actually give them food. People starved there. People had to line up in huge lines to get bread. Sometimes they accidentally produced only left shoes because of inefficiencies in the way of production. You've never answered how you control it.
Yeah, I can respond to that. Basically, at the point when the USSR was importing food, that was under Khrushchev, and I consider Khrushchev to be a revisionist. He brought in market reforms. He was basically not a socialist, he was a socialist in name. He was talking about basically a so-called goulash communism. Under him, that's when basically bureaucracy increased dramatically. And when we talk about, the Soviet Union, blank, billions of people died, in the United States, 90 million Native Americans were killed to get this land. I'm not sure how many millions of slaves died in building this country. And the fact saying that, people starved in the Soviet Union, there actually was a famine under Stalin. But that was during the time shortly after the Civil War and World War I, which were extremely destructive. And that was during the time of the NEP, when there was still a free market in grain production. There was still capitalism. And so what happened was wealthy peasants hoarded their grain, and, because of the self-interest profit motive, they hoarded their grain to inflate the prices, basically. And that led to mass starvation. And it was only when the government stepped in and cracked down on the kulaks, this so-called dictatorial government stepped in to save people from starving, that's when the famine ended, and people refer to that as dictatorial or whatever, but I think people have the right not to starve.
Thanks. And now the socialist alternative to answer that question as well.
Yeah, I don't think Stalin thought that people had the right not to start. You know, I think him and his government, his successive government, were destructive. I mean, yeah, they did put a person into states. What does that do? I mean, what does it do in the United States? It's just this contest to see who can do the most. It is this really destructive, bureaucratic, one state socialism. That was his famous line: socialism in one country. You don't feel the socialism should happen in one country. Stalin actively worked to prevent revolution in Spain, around the world, and other governments did as well, to stop the revolution from spreading. We would say if revolution had been allowed to spread throughout the 20th century without this impediment of Stalinism and this foreign workers' state that you had as the only real alternative to capitalism, history would be entirely different. You can't really judge socialism on those ideas, which are entirely false. It's not the right.
I don't want to get into this trustee debate because it's
Alright, let's cut this off for a second because the gentleman on the light blue shirt had a question.
I also one question, yeah. In 10, 15 years, we're going to have artificial intelligence where we're not going to need workers anymore, like the automation right now. We have automation of the workforce, so 90% of people are not going to have jobs. Right? So how will libertarian economy work off that?
Honestly, that's honestly one of the inevitable byproducts of a free market. You know, you couldn't have that in a planned economy because we'd be so focused on making sure everyone had, you know, a piece of chicken and mashed potatoes or something like that, which isn't wrong, but essentially it's being provided through the state. To associate, to directly answer your question about how libertarianism would work in that instance, if the principles would stick, you would have the right to yourself. The fact that the society is so automated and so technologically advanced, you're going to be self-sufficient on an individual level. So in that sense, we would be transcending the state. So you would be able to provide for yourself as long as you have access to these resources. And the best way to have access to these resources is not to have a monopoly on it through state means, but allowing a free market to flourish and to allow for these types of innovations. So I think that in the society that these individuals are preaching, I don't think that would be necessarily a byproduct of that, but a very viable byproduct of a free market. So essentially, I think that, you know, I don't know particularly how it would work, but I think that the principle of libertarianism would basically fasten and essentially would promote the further progression of promoting a more self-sufficient individual, a more self-sufficient organized society, and essentially just, you know, deem the state obsolete at that point.
Well, that's not true because one person just decides, not one person, like 5% of people would have their own organism production vehicle. That's like they do right now. There's all the factories, all the companies. They would already have all the technology to do it, and how would anybody else get the technology on it?
Well, free trade. You voluntarily trade.
Why would they trade? It's automated. They don't need you. What are the people that don't have any? There isn't going to be anything from the trade before the good.
Well, I mean, I think that you're also functioning on the assumption that these people, in that transition toward that society, they wouldn't have also accumulated access to these resources or acquired these resources. So to sit here and say that only the people who have, you know, the means of production are going to be able to succeed in such a society is a bit misleading, if you ask me. I think that if progressing towards that society would not be available to us if it weren't for voluntary trade, if it weren't for the innovations of the free market. So something like that probably wouldn't exist unless it would be an absolute totalitarian police state where, you know, your technology is used solely for the purpose of the state to maintain surveillance over individuals. And in that case, hopefully that will never be the society that we live in. However, considering the state's existence, it's a large it's a huge potential.
All right, next question goes to the guy in the red.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to start off, I think like everyone's here on the panel, we all want a freer society. Like, feel stifled by the society we live in. We want a freer society. Support how this debate figured out. I mean, we might question is generally, I guess, for the student delivery group, but five other, speakers. I mean, aside from the fact that I think it's a little bit odd to have a libertarian group, a group argue for libertarianism at a state-run school, I think there's a big question that's the whole idea that you can have this free association sounds very nice and want freedom as long as we don't hurt each other. And the problem is this oppressive state. And there is this oppressive state. There's no denying that. And we just get rid of that. I mean, what I don't see any discussion about is where is this oppressive state coming from? Why does it exist in the first place, and for whom? And yet, the idea that suggests a question of guns and how we harm each other. Because just to give an example, I don't know if people saw what happened today in Bangladesh, but there's been another workplace accident. There's a fire 5 months ago. A garment factory just collapsed, and so far 70 people are dead. Yesterday there was a giant crack in the building because these buildings are shit. And despite that, the workers seeing that, the manager said you have to go to work anyway. I mean, imagine if this building collapsed right now. I don't know how people would feel about it. Imagine if the day before we actually saw this thing crumbling, but we were told you have to go to school. You have to go to school. Because if not, you'll lose your job, right? And this is all done in the name of profit. This is all done because it had nothing to do with workplace safety. And you think, well, that's Bangladesh. Well, what just happened in Texas? The explosion of the fertilizer plant happened because there was no safety regulation. And the bosses and the owners of these big companies push people to work under unsafe conditions because of the name of profit. Everything that we've seen throughout the history of the free market is that it always tends to lead towards the accumulation of more and more wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. And that accumulation of wealth, which allows this ruling elite to wield the state, to wield this oppressive apparatus to keep us down. So that's my question, is we have to look, you can't just ignore the class divisions in society, to me, which is that's the root of state power. And so that's my question to everybody here. How do you deal with state power without looking at the class relations that exist in society?
I would like each representative to answer this question. You'll get 2 minutes, but I will remind you when you have 1 minute left, because we're trying to wrap this up. So when you have 1 minute left, if you'd like to make any closing remarks as well, please do so.
Why is it good for liberty to answer? Both of them might hopefully agree with the question.
We posed the question to everyone. So, and this is all.
Everyone will.
Alright, well, we can start with, you want to get it here? Alright, let's start with this students for liberty now.
Alright, so, yes, the state is oppressive. The state is absolutely oppressive. Well, why? It's quite simple. It uses force to procure its ends. So, the issue really isn't the fact that capitalism, or excuse me, it's not the fact that capitalism is the problem. Capitalism isn't the problem. It's crony capitalism. I like to draw a distinction here because a lot of people associate that what we have today with capitalism and free markets. This isn't a free market, actually. It's quite regulated by the government already. There's a mass amount of government intervention all throughout the market. So it's not a free market. Furthermore, it's not capitalism because it's not free voluntary trade in the sense that specific people who have wealth have access to political power. And the fact that they have access to political power allows them to provide less qualitative goods, less qualitative standards of workplaces through the force of the government, incorporating them. Corporations are government charters. So I think that essentially, if we remove the state from the equation, the force factor will no longer exist. So now, those individuals who are working in environments that are less qualitative, they can gather, they can organize, and work in their self-interest to say, hey, you know what? These conditions are poor, and we're not going to work here until you increase these standards. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when you have the state coming in and essentially monopolizing through corporation, through corporatism, the profits of companies. Now, there's something absolutely wrong with that. But on the other end, if you make profits merely through providing a qualitative good, through cooperation and voluntary free trade, there's really not much a problem. I think that the problem that you're talking about largely stems from the fact that these businessmen don't have the incentive to provide qualitative standards because they already have a standard enforced by the government. So until we remove that coercive entity, we're going to continue to have that type of standard in the workforce.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'd like to first ask the question on your point. When was there a free market? When and where was there a free market?
Certainly, as far as the United States is concerned, there's never been a free market. I don't know.
So the point is that just because you say that this isn't real capitalism, if you can't point to a period in time when there wasn't this so-called free market, then I mean that's a problem. The reality is, just because you call it crony capitalism or the state picking winners and losers, that doesn't mean that it's not real capitalism. Even the founder of the Mises Institute, Mises himself, even said, I forget the name of the article, but he said himself that just because the state is involved in the economy, that doesn't make it a socialist state or a mixed economy. It's still capitalist. So this is basically one of the main founders or main heads of the libertarian ideology himself saying this. And the point is, again, I want to stress the fact that you cannot divorce ideas from reality. Just because you say that this isn't real capitalism doesn't make it so. This is a privately owned system. There's a system where industry is privately owned, run by the profit motive, run by what they call the 1%, the capitalist class, at the detriment of the rest of the population. And we acknowledge that the point of the state is force. It's a body of armed men. But the question is, who does the state serve? Does it serve the 1% or does it serve the vast majority of the population? Does it provide for people the basic needs such as healthcare, education, and food? That's what we want. That's the point of socialism. To lead to communism. An example of what a society would look like, I think, under a libertarian type society. If you just look at Ron Paul, libertarian candidate, his campaign advisor, Ren Snyder, who helped raise millions of dollars for Ron Paul, he had a health condition. He couldn't afford health insurance. He ended up dying. Ron Paul didn't give him a single penny. And when Ron Paul was asked about whether people should be provided health care and these types of services, he said basically to the effect that no, society should let these people die.
Over to the socialist alternative group.
You have 2 minutes. Okay. So that was a great question about the state. Let's look at the origins of the state because if you look at all of human history, the majority of it, people didn't live in state-dominated societies. They lived in these hunter-gatherer societies which didn't really have anything that we would call a state that resembled what the state is today. It was only when people settled down and had this surplus wealth that they created these classes in society, the owners of the surplus and workers who worked for the people that owned it, that you needed a state to mitigate these conflicts, and the state would ultimately side on the side of the owners, and that's been the case pretty much since the agricultural revolution and up through capitalism. So you're not going to see the state go away anytime soon without a revolution, and then without a revolution that puts in place something else. We would say a workers' state, a state that's democratically run by the workers, that ultimately would slowly wither away. And you don't need a state under socialism. This would take 50, 100 years maybe, but ultimately we're not advocating for just a different kind of state, a state that would ultimately wither away under socialism.
Thank you. So at this point, we'd like to end the debate. If anyone has any questions, you can catch these guys after the show. And I hope you all enjoyed it.